Mr. Speaker, I want to join my colleagues who've spoken before me in support of the bill which is before us. And I had the occasion earlier to stand and to speak of the critical importance of this bill and why this is an important exercise for us to all focus on the criticality of what we are debating today. Mr. Speaker, I want to spend a few moments to respond to some issues raised by the Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Speaker. Because, Mr. Speaker, if I had any doubts in my mind that the Leader of the Opposition is a fraud, and permit me, Mr. Speaker, to use that word in our local parlance and how we use it, a person who is intent and deliberate in his attempts to give a false impression of what he is. He comes to this honorable house and pretends that he's engaging in an exercise to point out some serious flaws with what we are doing, and that there's something so wrong with what we are doing and he must point it out. And on many occasions, Mr. Speaker, I've had to say that some of the initiatives before us that he has criticized were actually started by him, advocated by him, pursued by him, and he could not have completed it. His government was a government of coulda, shoulda, woulda. They always coulda do something, they always shoulda do something, but they've not been able to get it done. And Mr. Speaker, I can point out the GPH agreement. This was a gentleman, the honorable member from Miku South, who signed agreement with Royal Caribbean for the redevelopment of Port Castries. I'm sure the member from Castries East can remember that. Not on one occasion, but on two occasions, and still could not have gotten it done. When we came into office, there was a draft GPH agreement on the table. And I can show you a posting he made where he visited certain cruise ship interests, boasting about the redevelopment that will take place. The senior minister, I think, went with him, and the senior minister, the member for Castries North, can verify whether what I'm saying is true or not.
They left him in his hotel room.
They left him in his hotel room, and he went by himself to the meeting. I wasn't there, I cannot verify that, Mr. Speaker. But what we did on every occasion was to make it better than what it was before. On every occasion, to make it better. So in 2017, he prepared a draft sovereign wealth fund bill. But as usual, coulda, shoulda, woulda, it never happened. In 4 years, he could not have gotten it going, Mr. Speaker. And today, we put forward a bill that is more progressive, that is more focused, and is more relevant to our needs, Mr. Speaker. He will start and give the impression that something is wrong with it. So, Mr. Speaker, let me pick out a few points. He speaks about the custodian, and he says that we are picking a custodian and we didn't even go out to tender. If you look in his draft, Mr. Speaker, the custodian, section 28(1), the Bank of St. Lucia is, subject to subsection 2, appointed as the primary custodian of the bank. He didn't tender for it. He did not tender. He actually put it in the legislation, determined by himself. But he wants in ours that it should, and we've not started yet, huh? We've not started yet. We're just discussing the bill, but he's already accusing us of not having gone to tender. But in his draft, he was already announcing who the custodian is. Now, do you think the member from Miku South is in any place to tell anybody about tendering? Seriously? Do you recall the Uranora International Airport Redevelopment Project? Was there any tendering? St. Jude's, was there any tendering?
Member for
Mr.
Miku
Speaker.
South. Member for Miku South.
Thank you,
Mr. Speaker, on the point of order, the member is misleading the House. The HIA airport did go to tender, Mr. Speaker. OECC was the overall developer, and every single component of the HIA airport, Mr. Speaker, were put to tender.
Mr. Speaker, I don't want to engage in a debate. We all know, Mr. Speaker, and we know it was, there is a letter that was written by the member for Mico South to the general manager of SLASPA instructing him to award the contract to a particular company for the redevelopment. Now, hear what he says. And he really believes we are foolish that there was one general contractor, but he doesn't say that person was not chosen by tender, but all the small subcontractors were by tender. I will repeat my point. The general contractor for the redevelopment of the Uranura International Airport was not chosen by tender.
Member for Mico South.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Again, on a point of order, the member would go and look at the legislation. The member is misleading the House.
But the member has repeated exactly what you said.
But that's all I did.
You said
OECC was the overall contractor.
Yes.
OECC was the overall developer. Okay? Assigned because of the Taiwanese, and every single contract, the piling, the superstructure, every component of that project was being tendered and overseen by not only OECC, but by SLASPA and by HERI.
Mr. Speaker.
Member for Castries East.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, just on a point of clarification, Mr. Speaker.
Are you yielding member for Castries South?
Mr. Speaker, the control tower that was being built is a fact. OECC did the control tower on its own with no tendering.
And Mr. Speaker, we don't need to debate this. I am saying that the general contractor was not chosen by tender. And he is saying that I'm wrong because the overall contractor was OECC.
He's using, remember, he's using the word.
Yes, so let me proceed.
He's using the word developer.
Okay, I said developer. Seriously. But, Mr. Speaker, let me continue. Let me continue. Mr. Speaker, you know, you can see when a man is broken and defeated before the battle has even started. But Mr. Speaker, let me continue. Mr. Speaker. And he was coming for war. I've never seen such a war. And according to the member from Catherine's office, he came dressed like a cowboy, but it's only reggae music that was playing. Mr. Speaker, hear this. And he speaks about tendering, and he speaks about how the ministers are controlling everything, and everything in our bill is about the minister. You remember that the Orange Grove Mall building, which was an old diamond, it was Amazona Properties that was responsible for it. But who negotiated its sale? Who announced its sale? Who signed the agreement for its sale? But then all of a sudden, ministers in this bill will be responsible for everything. But he forgot when he was Prime Minister. And I want Mr. Speaker to go to the National Economic Fund Act. And I knew he was going to come here today and say that that was supposed to be his sovereign fund. I knew he was going to say that, and he was going to pretend that it is. But just look at some of the clauses, Mr. Speaker. And listen to the functions of the fund, the National Economic Fund. To advance loans for a government-approved project, to provide investment for a government-approved capital project, to reduce government debt, to purchase government bonds, and the last one, which we amended and added, and I will come to that in a while, to provide monies for purpose approved by Cabinet. In every instance, it's about monies to be used for government operations. How could that be a sovereign wealth fund? and the member from Grosile explained to you what a sovereign wealth fund is. But let me go on to make the point about ministers. Listen to this. The board consists of no less than 5 members and no more than 7 members to be appointed by cabinet. So who's in cabinet? Not ministers? Okay, let's go on. Mr. Speaker, and you know, I could go through the entire, Mr. Speaker, provisions of the Act. The entire provisions of the Act, and show you, and you will notice for many other statutory corporations in St. Lucia that ministers appoint sometimes through cabinet or with the approval of cabinet. That is how it is done. Because at the end of the day, the executive is held responsible for the assets of the country. That's how it is done, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, I want to make another point about the National Economic Fund, Mr. Speaker. Because the honorable member, Mr. Speaker, comes to this house, and I really find what he does, Mr. Speaker, to be really disgusting, Mr. Speaker, I'll tell you so, and deceitful. Deceitful. He comes to this house, and he says to this honorable house, Mr. Speaker, that this government amended the legislation, and where it said a capital project, to provide funding for a capital project, we removed the word capital, so it means any project, the monies can be paid out of the National Economic Fund. And Mr. Speaker, that's not true. All we did was to amend the legislation to add, Mr. Speaker, a provision that says to provide monies for a purpose approved by cabinet. But he stands in this honorable house, says we amended the legislation, deliberately misleads the house, Mr. Speaker. But that's not what we did. We did not amend it in the way in which he said, but it suits his purpose, and he says it in this honorable house, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, there must be a sanction for persons who do this, because you are distorting the truth, Mr. Speaker, to make a point. You're an honorable member in this house, Mr. Speaker. And I had to stand and correct him when he was speaking, because this is blatant dishonesty in the house, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I know I have some other colleagues who want to speak, and I want to be short this afternoon. But let me say something specifically about the Sovereign Wealth Fund. Mr. Speaker, I have heard about Sovereign Wealth Funds for many years. I've read about them, Mr. Speaker. And there are some famous Sovereign Wealth Funds. You would hear, Mr. Speaker, of the Sovereign Wealth Fund from Norway, which is the #1 fund in the world, Mr. Speaker, with substantial investments in Apple and Microsoft. You would hear, Mr. Speaker, of the Saudi Arabia, the PIF, Mr. Speaker. I think they even own the Newcastle United Football Club, Mr. Speaker. So there are many in China, Mr. Speaker. China alone has 7 sovereign funds, 7 sovereign funds. The United Arab Emirates has 3 or 4 sovereign funds, Mr. Speaker. So these are institutional investment mechanisms, set up in countries for varied purposes, Mr. Speaker. And they're well known, they're well established, and the member from Soufrière, Saltibus, pointed out, Mr. Speaker, the principles, the honorable member from Castries East, the Prime Minister, read out all of the 20+ principles that guide the functioning of sovereign funds. And the honorable member from Soufrière actually showed you how that every single principle is reflected in this legislation, which means that what we have created and established adheres to all the guiding principles, Mr. Speaker. The member from Castries East went through every section of the bill, Mr. Speaker, to explain how the sovereign fund will function. But the member from Mico South, Mr. Speaker, is an enemy of progress, Mr. Speaker. An enemy of progress. He's an enemy of the state of St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker. And I have no hesitation in saying so. I'm not going to respond to all that is said about the CIP, whatnot. I will not be drawn into this. We will go into the courts, Mr. Speaker, and we'll settle this matter appropriately, Mr. Speaker. But he wants to give the impression that there is no need for a sovereign wealth fund in St. Lucia because we have the National Economic Fund. We already have the National Economic Fund. You know, Mr. Speaker, the National Economic Fund is not a sovereign wealth fund, cannot function like a sovereign wealth fund. It does not adhere to the principles. The National Economic Fund is a funding source for the government of St. Lucia, for its debts, for its functioning and its operations. That is totally contrary to what a sovereign wealth fund is. And if you look at section 52 of our proposed legislation, it is very clear, Mr. Speaker, very clear. The assets of the fund shall not be used to provide credit to the government, public enterprises, private sector entities, or any person or entity. And B, as collateral for debts, guarantees, commitments, or other liabilities of other persons or entity, whether public or private. So you could see there's a vast difference between the National Economic Fund and the Sovereign Wealth Fund that we seek to establish. The National Economic Fund cannot be, Mr. Speaker. Now you'd recall, Mr. Speaker, that a member from Miku South came into government. There was legislation that spoke of the establishment of the National Economic Fund. All he had to do was to set up the regulations, but he didn't. He went, he passed an entire act, Mr. Speaker, and I won't tell you the consequences of what he did. That, like I said, will be dealt with in another space, Mr. Speaker. But I want all Senators to understand that a sovereign wealth fund is distinctly different to a hedge fund. A private equity fund is different to the National Economic Fund because of the mandate and the way in which they function. And a member from Grosley pointed out, a sovereign wealth fund in its simplest expression is basically how you can take some savings from the present, invest it, so future generations can benefit from it, Mr. Speaker. In its simplest way, it means that government must not be able to use those monies for everyday requirements, for operations, for paying debt, whatnot. That is not why you create a sovereign wealth fund. So the monies that are put in there need to be invested. There's going to be an investment manager. There's going to be a custodian that overlooks and ensures that all the prerequisites and requirements are met, Mr. Speaker. This is critical, and why it is critical, Mr. Speaker, is because, and I think the member from Babonneau made the point, and the member from Soufrière, we must learn as a country and as individuals, as families, that we must always find some money to save, Mr. Speaker. Despite the fact that we still have needs, you must always put money aside for the future, Mr. Speaker. And I think our parents would have practiced that so often, no matter how hard things are at home. They always put a little $10 aside, put it in the bank. Because, Mr. Speaker, there will come a rainy day, Mr. Speaker. And you need to learn to put monies aside for those days. It is not the same as a pension fund, the same as NIC. NIC has liabilities on it because NIC has an obligation to pay people their pension when the time arises. That is not a sovereign wealth fund. The sovereign wealth fund is about taking the monies, the savings, Mr. Speaker, and investing it, Mr. Speaker, to make sure that the future generations, the generations that are yet born, Mr. Speaker, will have some savings, Mr. Speaker. And what I am excited about the Sovereign Wealth Fund, Mr. Speaker, is the ingenuity, the creativity, the deep thinking, Mr. Speaker, that goes behind how it functions and what it will do, Mr. Speaker. The link with the climate adaptation policy, Mr. Speaker. That there is a lot of thinking, creative thinking, Mr. Speaker, that goes behind this, Mr. Speaker. And in speaking with the members, Mr. Speaker, around this table, Mr. Speaker, we have, Mr. Speaker, we have identified ways and means in which the fund can be capitalized. In this legislation, we speak of monies, Mr. Speaker. We speak of monies, Mr. Speaker, of some of the CIP. And I really like it, Mr. Speaker, because if we can take some of the money, the donations, Mr. Speaker, from the CIP, and to put it into the fund and make sure that future generations can benefit from it, that's a positive sign, Mr. Speaker. That's a positive sign, Mr. Speaker, that we are taking some of those monies now, Mr. Speaker, and putting it aside for the future, Mr. Speaker. There also speaks of, Mr. Speaker, proceeds from sale of assets, Mr. Speaker, that we can get some monies from the sale of assets and put it, Mr. Speaker, in the Sovereign Wealth Fund. And the other point, contributions, Mr. Speaker. The member from Ancillary Canneries, the member from Castries East will tell you that we can leverage, Mr. Speaker, in this present historical period, we can leverage, the desire for us to ensure that we have climate adaptation and mitigation measures in place, Mr. Speaker, to get support that we can put into that fund, Mr. Speaker, for the future generations, Mr. Speaker. Because if climate change, Mr. Speaker, undermines our survival possibilities, Mr. Speaker, we have to be able, in a very engaging way, say to the international community, the international interest, that yes, we are prepared to do X, Y, and Z to save this earth, Mr. Speaker, in exchange for support from them, Mr. Speaker. And those monies go into the Sovereign Wealth Fund. Again, there is an overriding understanding. How can we accumulate savings in a fund guided by some very strict principles as to what we can do with the money to make sure that 30, 40, 50 years down the road, that there is money available for that generation, Mr. Speaker.
Ching, ching.
And that is different to what you will use the National Economic Fund for.
So
Where
that's real ching, ching in the box.
that is ching ching. And Mr. Speaker, when the ching ching did not come, you know what he said? We didn't mean ching ching, we meant your credit card. I never had two credit cards each other and make them the song ching ching, Mr. Speaker. But we're going to wait to hear what next. Because be ready, Mr. Speaker, we enter in the silly season and a lot of silly things will be said. They start already. So be ready to hear they will remove VAT again. They will remove health and security levy. They will increase everybody's salary by, how much was the bonus in December? $500? They will give $1,000 in December. Would have. We bonds. Mr. Speaker, let me tell you, they have so many promises to come. Because let me tell you, when you have no shame, you believe you can say anything, anytime, and just move on, Mr. Speaker. But I'm really proud, Mr. Speaker, of the member from Castries East, the member from Ancillary Canneries that has worked hard on this, Mr. Speaker, to bring this to where it is. The last government, and I will give them some credit, took the step of coming up with a draft piece of legislation to advance this very noble idea, Mr. Speaker. But of course, it had its flaws, Mr. Speaker, but they could not get the job done. Like many things, they could not get the job done. Because somebody, they're better suited for just saying things, Mr. Speaker. They shoulda, they coulda, they woulda, Mr. Speaker. We are the government that's delivering. We are the government putting people first, Mr. Speaker. And I'm looking forward to the implementation of the Sovereign Wealth Fund. And I'm looking forward to telling the future generations to continue the good work, to build the fund, to build the resources of the fund, and to be able to make a meaningful contribution to our national development. Thank you very much.